I hit a roadblock pretty early in the process of making my Grimdark Blood Angel army. The red armor was easy enough. Bright colors tend to take weathering the best anyway, and the stippling method I used does a lot of the Grimdark work for me. Death Company Black was pretty straightforward too, and while I tried a couple different methods, both were pretty natural offshoots of that original stippling technique. But then we get to the third color that Blood Angels are known for: gold. Bright, shiny, mirror-polished gold. And you can probably see how that would pose some grimdark issues. If that sounds familiar to you, have no fear. My name's Colt, this is Gone Hollow Minis, and I might have the perfect Grimdark Gold recipe for you. Painting metallics, especially gold, in the Grimdark style can be kinda tricky. Grimdark thrives on a surface finish that's dingy, grimy, and fairly matte. Most true metallic metal techniques just won't work. Especially with golds. When gold gets too dark or dingy, it starts reading more as bronze, and while that can be a problem if you don't know how to take advantage of it, that's exactly the kind of look we're going to lean into with this recipe. We're going to take cues from things like outdoor statues here, and specifically how they tarnish. We'll still be going for a warmer metallic, but we won't be going for that bright yellow gold. It just won't cut it for this style. Now let's talk techniques. A lot of the time, Grimdark metals just come down to dry brushing a couple different metallics onto your miniature, slathering it in enamel or oil wash, and calling it good. And don't get me wrong, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. We all have our own hobby preferences and styles, and if you enjoy that process and that end result, then go for it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's just that my preferences tend to lead me away from using things like oils and enamels as much as I can. There's nothing wrong with using them, of course, and a few of my recipes do rely on them, but I try to make the most out of my standard acrylic paints instead. If you've seen my approach to Grimdark before, you're probably just waiting for me to tell you which paints you need to dip your sponge into in order to start getting paint onto our miniature. But I want you to hold off real quick. While only using sponging is definitely an option, I will warn you that instead of looking weathered, your metallics will probably end up just looking grainy. And before we move on, I'd like to explain why that is. You probably already know this, but our paint is made of pigments and a medium. The pigment is what gives our paint its color, while the medium is mostly colorless and is what suspends our pigments into an actual paint. For standard colors, these pigments can be pretty small, to the point that we really don't notice the individual little specks. Metallic paints are a little bit different. In addition to deciding our color, metallic paints also need to reflect light in order to actually look metallic. Most commonly, this is done with mica powder or aluminum powder, or probably a mix of the two. The problem is that these add-ins can't be ground as fine as regular pigments, so the individual grains are more noticeable in the final paint product. This is what leads certain paints, often the cheaper ones, to look a little bit more like glitter in a bottle than actual metallic paint. So if we just start sponging our layers on, those larger pigments will appear starker, leading to some graininess in our texture. But how do we fix this texture problem? Well, now that we know a little bit more about how our paint actually functions, we can go ahead and apply that knowledge to our approach to Grimdark metals. Remember, we're trying to tone down the shine that a lot of true metallic metals end up with. We want grime, we want grit, and we want texture, but we want to build those things up in a way that doesn't sacrifice our control over our surface finish. So getting started with our color choice, I'm going to be using these paints for this Grimdark Gold. This will get us to a nice battle-ready standard for our Sanguinary Guard, while also giving us a nice base to work from if we want to spend more time on more technical painting and weathering later. Now the key to this is to build up our layers in a way that doesn't look too granular, and to do that we're going to want to start on the right foot with our base coat colors. We can go ahead and start with the black primer to get our recesses nice and dark. As always, you don't need to be all too picky about this, just use what you have on hand and are comfortable with. After that, we're going to start shifting that base coat to a warmer hue. We're going to use some brigandine brown here, darkened with a little bit of black. And we'll be applying this with a heavy dry brush, or by overbrushing, whichever term you want to use. Once we have this nice dark brown ready to go, we're going to get some of our paint onto our big soft bristled brush, then use something like a paper towel to take most of it off. We're not going full dry brushing dry here, but we don't want to leave globs. Now just take our brush to our miniature, and with light controlled motions, we're going to coat all of the mid to high tones with our dark brown. Just make sure to leave black in all the cracks and crevices. Once that's done, we'll have a miniature with nicely darkened recesses, but a base coat that lends itself better to the warm metallics we're going to be applying next. Our first metallic is going to be Balthazar Gold. This is a nice brown, kind of bronzy gold that'll be a great place to work from. Okay, I need to be honest here. I was technically out of Balthazar Gold, but I mixed up a combination of Army Painter Rough Iron and Evil Chrome, and that got me pretty darn close. But if you have Balthazar Gold, just go ahead and use that. Now we can move on to applying our Balthazar Gold. We're going to do this by dry brushing it on. The technique is pretty similar to what we did with the brown, but we'll take a little bit more of the paint off of our brush before we take it to our mini. Load up your brush, then using a piece of paper towel or an old well palette, work most of the paint off the bristles. Don't work all of it out, but make sure it's dry enough to leave a nice even layer on our brown base coat. Then, using the same light motions as before, just go ahead and apply this all over your miniature. Make sure to be light enough to leave some of the black and brown in the recesses, but cover most of the whole mini. Now, it wouldn't be a Gone Hollow Minis tutorial without at least a little bit of sponging. Now, I know, I said no sponging earlier, but now that we have a nice even base coat from our dry brushing, we can go ahead and build up texture a little bit easier without worrying about graininess. And unlike in the red tutorial, here I really do mean sponging. I found that the sponge works best with our metallic pigments to build up natural looking texture, though using a regular old brush can still be helpful for more harder to reach areas. We're going to use Sycorax bronze here, thin just beyond a layer consistency, to kind of establish our mid-tones. This will more or less be what the armor reads as on the final product. Using our sponge, we're going to apply our Sycorax bronze to all the flat surfaces. Make sure to leave the Balthazar gold in the recesses and shadows. Okay, one more risky highlight. We're going to take our Sycorax bronze and mix it with a little bit of Vallejo metal color silver. This will give us a nice highlight tone. You can use whichever silver you want and have on hand. I just like the metal color series because of those notorious metal pigments are a little bit smaller. Whichever one you use, you want to make sure you're careful in how much you add to your Sycorax bronze. This can be a pretty overpowering layer if applied too thickly, and we don't want to turn our gold into silver. Okay, last sponging layer here. With this lighter gold color, we're going to be really carefully applying some small splotches onto the highest points of our armor to really build up that contrast. Now you can totally stop with the highlights here, but I'm going to add one more last step. Taking pure Vallejo metal color silver, I'm going to take a really fine brush and add a few scratches, chips, and edge highlights to the corners of our armor panels. Be even more careful with this layer, as being too heavy-handed can really turn our gold into silver. All I'm really doing with this is putting a thin highlight on some of the more noticeable edges, as well as tracing some super thin scratches and battle damage. This will show up pretty starkly, especially with this particular silver, so make sure to go easy. Now once we're done with that, that's pretty much all of our solid layers. But in order to really amp up that contrast, there's just a couple more steps that you might want to consider. To make this armor really pop, we're going to go back and add one final layer of tarnish, going back into our recesses and glazing in some of our original black-brown mix. This will not only redefine some of the shadows that we might have lost, but also give a really nice matte surface finish that will contrast nicely with our shinier metallic highlights. Okay, ready for the last magic step? We're going to go back into our recesses again here, but this time with a glaze of a really dark desaturated purple. This really is the magic color here, and while I could go on for hours about how much I love the versatility of the color purple, I'll rein myself in for this video. The purple here is going to make our shadows a lot more interesting, shifting the tone of our recesses into a more colorful, interesting, and dare I say artistic hue. Now for my Sanguinary Guard, this is usually about where I stop. While I do want grit and grime and grimdark, these are suits of artificer armor, so going too hard wouldn't really fit their vibe, I don't think. But the whole point of this recipe is that it doesn't have to be used on Sanguinary Guard. You can use it on whichever gold miniatures you want. And maybe on those miniatures, doing a little bit more weathering makes more sense. It's really more of a baseline gold that you can alter to your own needs. Verdigris, doing a little bit of heat bloom, and maybe some color shifting in the recesses would all look great. Just maybe not on my Sanguinary Guard. But all that weathering is a video for another time. From here, I set to finishing the rest of the miniature. Most of this was fairly straightforward stuff. The armor makes up the bulk of the mini, so with that done, everything else was done with fairly straightforward techniques so as to not overclutter the already textured armor. And once that was done, I was left with this. Pure metallic miniatures can be unexpectedly tricky to paint in the Grimdark style. We of course want grime, but we need to be careful on how we develop it on our miniature. The combination of stippling, chipping, and surface variation here are a really effective way of getting that grimy, grimdark feel without spending hours on each Sanguinary Guard. And of course, this is just the base. This is a battle-ready tutorial, but you can absolutely keep going with the weathering effects from here. In particular, I think I'm going to experiment a little bit more with Verdigris and see how that looks on some of the nooks and crannies of the armor. But like I said, that's probably a video for another time. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this video gave you ideas on how to paint your own Sanguinary Guard to fit in with your Grimdark army, while also standing out in their own way. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, make sure to drop them in the comment section below. I'll be responding to as many as I can. And while you're down there, why not drop a like and subscribe if this video helped you out at all. I hope this video gave you the chance to tell your own hobby story. And until next time, of course, Don't you dare go hollow.